He smiled when he shook his hand, but behind Michael B. Jordan's eyes was something colder than rage: memory. Memory of a boy who never got justice. So when Kash Patel took the MIC and dared to defend a system built to break people, no one expected what came next. One sentence. That's all it took. And when Michael said it, the crowd fell completely silent. But was it justice, or revenge? What did he say, and why did it feel like the whole country was watching? The lobby of the Westwood Civic Center shimmered with glass and gold as celebrities, activists, and politicians mingled beneath the towering chandelier. Michael B. Jordan stepped through the revolving doors dressed in a sleek midnight blue tuxedo, his expression unreadable. Tonight's event was marketed as a fundraiser for the Coalition for Justice Reform, but for those who knew the undercurrents of Hollywood and Washington, it was more than that. The gala had become a hotspot for whispered alliances, PR redemption stories, and quiet flexes of influence. As flashbulbs popped around him, Michael didn't smile. He was here for something deeper. As he moved past actors greeting each other like royalty, one could sense the tightness in his shoulders, the restraint in his eyes. His invitation was accepted eagerly. He was beloved, bankable, and visibly supportive of justice reform. But what no one knew was the personal reason he had RSVP'd in the first place. Inside, music from a live quartet echoed against marble walls as servers weaved through the crowd with silver trays. Near the center of the room stood a group of politicians, laughing just a little too loud. Among them was Kash Patel. He wasn't expected. His name had been added quietly to the guest list at the last minute, supposedly as a representative voice for policy balance. But everyone knew Kash. Former Trump official, vocal critic of woke culture, and supporter of aggressive policing, he was no stranger to controversy. His presence wasn't just unexpected. It was calculated. Some guests glanced over and then looked away quickly, unsure how to process the tension. Others whispered behind champagne glasses, noting that the man who once blocked a bill on prison mental health funding was now rubbing elbows at a charity event focused on justice. As the evening moved forward, guests were ushered to a grand dining hall arranged in concentric circles around a raised stage. It was here that panel discussions were scheduled, celebrity voices, legal scholars, and former inmates speaking on criminal justice. Michael was set to be part of the second panel. Kash would be on the third. That was no coincidence. Word had already spread that the organizers wanted to foster a healthy debate. The room had been designed for friction, and both men had unknowingly become the magnets. As people took their seats, table cards were exchanged with subtle glances, like a high-stakes poker game played in linen and laughter. At table 9, he sat next to a woman named Elise, a prosecutor-turned-advocate, who whispered as she leaned over her wine glass, "You know he's only here to provoke." Michael didn't answer. He didn't need to. Elise looked at him more closely, then said, "You've got something planned, don't you?" Again, silence. Michael wasn't the type to script a moment. But he had a truth that burned too hot to stay hidden. And tonight, under the pretense of unity, he would let it burn the right name. Kash had become more than a policymaker in his mind. He was a symbol. A symbol of every smug face that had looked the other way when his brother begged for help. A symbol of the system that didn't just fail people, it erased them. The first panel came and went. Speeches were made, applause was given, but the energy in the room was tense. Guests glanced toward Kash, who now stood near the bar, laughing with a glass of scotch in his hand like he was already winning something. Michael didn't speak to him. Not yet. Instead, he waited. Watched. Timed everything down to the breath. When he finally walked to the stage for his panel, there was a calm in his steps that didn't match the fire building behind his eyes. His voice, when he began, was smooth, measured, even warm. He spoke about the human cost of incarceration, the importance of investing in communities before they collapse, the success stories of young men and women who just needed a second chance. His panel began with warm, familiar ground, personal stories, hope, system flaws, and community action. Michael shared a story about a youth boxing program he sponsored and how mentorship could keep kids out of trouble. The audience nodded, clapped, smiled. It was what they expected. But beneath the surface, tension swirled like a storm behind closed doors. The host gestured toward the third panel's table and mentioned Kash by name, teasing the next discussion. Michael's jaw flexed. He looked out over the crowd, scanning faces, and let his silence linger just a second longer than expected. The lights dimmed slightly in preparation for the next session. The room shifted. Guests leaned forward. And the curtains were just beginning to rise. Years before the gala, Michael B. Jordan sat alone in a cold visitation room inside a correctional facility just outside Newark, New Jersey. The sharp fluorescent lights above him buzzed softly while he stared at the door, waiting. Then it opened, and in shuffled his older brother, Damon. Wearing a faded jumpsuit and shackled at the ankles, Damon offered the same soft smile he always had. He had been sentenced to 22 years for armed robbery, a crime he always said he didn't commit. The court ruled fast, too fast, and Michael, sitting in that courtroom years ago, could feel in his gut that something wasn't right. The evidence was thin, the witnesses unreliable, and the entire process rushed like a formality in a system too bloated to care. Michael could never forget the look on Damon's face when the judge read the verdict. It was quiet acceptance. Not because he was guilty, but because he knew the system never gave boys like him a real shot. Michael remembered every second of that trial. The smirks from the prosecution, the overworked public defender, the absence of any real evidence. But none of that mattered in a system designed to push cases through like products on an assembly line. His brother's life had been boxed, labeled, and thrown into a place where men were forgotten. What stung even more was learning who had influenced the policy changes that made his brother's trial go so fast. Michael had read every article, every name, and Kash Patel's name kept showing up. A quiet architect behind legislative proposals that cut legal aid, increased prosecution quotas, and supported harsher minimum sentences. Kash's fingerprints were all over the machinery that swallowed Damon whole. That day in the visitation room, Damon had tried to reassure him. "I'm good, lil bro, don't lose sleep over me." But Michael did. Night after night. Even when his acting career started rising, and he was working on big-budget movies, part of his heart stayed locked in that correctional facility. He poured his money into lawyers, investigators, non-profit watchdogs, trying to undo the sentence. He didn't just want justice. He needed it. Because Damon wasn't just his brother. He was the man who raised him when their father left. He taught him to throw a punch, to walk tall, to never lower his eyes for anyone. And now he was reduced to a number in a file. Michael couldn't let that be the end of his story. Michael knew he couldn't fix everything, but he could expose something. He started showing up at more advocacy events, quietly funding documentaries, visiting youth detention centers when no press was around. At first, it was personal. Then it became something bigger. He realized there were thousands of Damons in the system. Boys who had been sentenced by statistics instead of facts. Families crushed by bureaucratic weight. And Kash Patel's name kept appearing. His speeches. His legal memos. His connections to private prison donors. To Michael, this wasn't just politics, it was a war. A quiet, brutal war fought in courtrooms and policy meetings, where families like his were always the first casualties. The fire that burned in Michael wasn't theatrical, it was forged in quiet waiting rooms, in unanswered phone calls, in prison guards who treated his brother like an animal. It was the kind of fire that never goes out, only grows more silent and focused. He had kept his distance from politics publicly, but privately, he was building something. He met with civil rights lawyers in secret. He began consulting with writers on policy-centered projects. And when he was offered the seat at the gala panel, he said yes without hesitation. The invite was an opportunity. The gala wasn't just an event. It was a stage. And this time, he wasn't going to act. He kept his reason hidden. Even his closest friends didn't know. When the press asked him why he supported the coalition, he'd mention hope and fairness and second chances. All true. But not the whole truth. Because the whole truth was that Michael had memorized every word of the appeal that had failed to free Damon. He had highlighted every name attached to the rejection, including Kash Patel's. His presence at the gala wasn't coincidence. It was confrontation, veiled in velvet. It was the most silent, patient form of protest a man like him could stage, Because this time, the spotlight wasn't on a red carpet. It was on a decision. The night before the gala, Michael had sat alone in his apartment, the TV off, the city humming outside his window. He opened a drawer and pulled out a photo of him and Damon as kids, standing in front of their grandmother's house. Damon had his arm around Michael's shoulder, smiling wide with 2 missing front teeth. Michael ran a thumb over the image, then folded it and slipped it into his inside coat pocket. It was the only thing he brought that night that wasn't custom-tailored. He didn't know what would happen at the gala. But he knew this: he was no longer just a guest. He was a message. He walked into that ballroom not as a movie star, but as a brother with unfinished business. The cameras caught his charisma, but not the pain in his silence. As he took his seat on stage during the second panel, he wasn't thinking about applause. He was thinking about how many voices had been silenced by people like Kash. How many names had disappeared in court records, how many lives had unraveled in the name of order. Every second he sat in that chair, he felt the weight of that folded photo against his chest. And he reminded himself, he wasn't here to debate. He was here to expose. The transition between the second and third panels was short, but in those few minutes, the air changed. The chatter got quieter. Glasses were refilled faster. People leaned closer to one another, sensing the tension that was about to unfold. The host, a seasoned journalist known for tough interviews, introduced the next discussion as a spirited exchange of views on justice policy from 2 very different perspectives. The phrase felt too polished, too light, because everyone already knew what was really coming. The actor with a cause and the politician with a record. The collision wasn't just expected, it was scheduled. Kash Patel walked up to the stage with the confidence of someone used to walking into rooms where people couldn't challenge him. Wearing a sharp grey suit and a smirk that never quite left his face, he waved casually to the audience as if this were his show. When he sat down across from Michael, he didn't look at him, he looked through him. Michael, still as stone, returned the stare for a half-second before glancing away. It wasn't the time. Not yet. The moderator opened with softball questions, talking points on bipartisan reform, budget allocations, and public safety. Kash leaned into every answer like a lawyer presenting to a jury, emphasizing the need for accountability and tough love to fix what he called cultural breakdown. He used words like incentives and structure, while completely ignoring the word compassion. Michael listened without interrupting, but the audience started to shift. Some heads nodded, others frowned. The mood was changing, and it was only a matter of time before someone broke the surface. When Michael finally spoke, his voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was calm, deep, and carried the weight of lived experience. Justice, he said, isn't about numbers. It's about people. Families. Kids. He paused, letting the silence land. Then he added, and when you've only ever looked at crime from behind a desk, you forget what it feels like to lose someone to it. It wasn't a direct attack. Not yet. But it landed. Even Kash blinked, caught off guard for a split second before adjusting his posture and forcing a smile. That was when Kash switched tactics. He laughed, just enough to sound dismissive, and said, I understand your emotion, Michael, but facts don't care about feelings. You're a great actor, no doubt. But we're not on a set. We're talking about real policies for real people. The words were sharp, calculated to belittle. A ripple moved through the crowd. The journalist raised a brow. Michael didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He looked at Kash, then to the audience, and said, let's talk about real people, then. I've got a story. Michael started telling a story about a boy who had been locked in solitary for stealing a cell phone. The boy had no record, no violence, just poverty. He described the cement walls, the fluorescent light that never turned off, the food tray shoved under a slot twice a day. The crowd went silent. No one coughed. No one shifted. Michael's voice stayed calm, even as his eyes darkened with memory. He said the boy's mind unraveled after months alone. That he began talking to shadows. That the prison staff ignored his screams. That no one called his family when he stopped responding. That a guard found him curled in a corner, cold and still, with fingernails torn and bloody from clawing the walls. Kash tried to jump in, tried to pivot the conversation back to data. But now it was too late. Michael had taken the room. Every eye was on him. And every word was starting to circle closer to the truth no one expected him to say. The journalist leaned in, sensing it. Michael finished the story quietly. He died in a concrete room. 19 years old. No criminal past. No one held accountable. He paused. His name was Lamar. There was a hush. Then a shift. A low, collective breath as the name settled into the air like a stone dropped into water. Lamar. Michael's brother's middle name. The pieces began connecting in the audience's minds. Some gasped. Others just stared. Kash looked unsettled now. For the first time, he didn't have a smirk. He cleared his throat, but no words came. Michael had drawn blood without ever raising his voice. And the room knew it. And he still wasn't finished. The silence that followed Michael's story was like a vacuum. No clapping. No questions. Just a thick, heavy stillness that felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. The journalist, usually quick to jump in with a follow-up, just stared, eyes wide. Kash shifted in his chair, clearly rattled. He looked toward the moderator, hoping for an escape route, but none came. All eyes stayed locked on Michael. This wasn't the dramatic high point of a panel. This was something deeper. Something real. And it wasn't done unfolding. What had started as a tense debate was now something else entirely, a moment of exposure. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as if he were talking to a single person instead of 100. "See, it's easy to talk about crime when it's not your family," he said softly. "Easy to write memos and pass laws when you never have to see the wreckage up close." He didn't need to say Kash's name anymore. The entire audience already knew who he was talking about. It's not a policy issue. It's a people issue. And the people you write off are the ones who live with the consequences. Kash finally tried to fire back. He sat straighter, voice louder now, as he said, "Tragedy doesn't mean the system is broken. It means we need to improve it, not destroy it. Crime is still real, and we can't lose sight of that. One story doesn't change the facts." He looked proud of the sentence, like it had been waiting in his back pocket for the perfect moment. But Michael's answer came without hesitation. "You ever been to a funeral for someone who didn't have to die?" The question hit like a hammer. Kash looked like he wanted to answer but couldn't find the words fast enough. Michael didn't wait for one. And then Michael stood. He hadn't planned to, but something in the room pulled him to his feet. He took a slow step forward on stage, no podium, no microphone, just his voice and that folded photo still tucked in his jacket. He reached into the pocket, pulled it out, and unfolded it in front of the crowd. It was the picture of him and Damon. "This is who I fight for," he said. "This isn't about winning a debate. It's about making sure no more brothers end up behind bars because people in power treat children like numbers." The sentence cut through the silence like a blade. His tone never rose, but the power behind it filled the room. Somewhere in the room, a woman started to cry. Another man stood up, his eyes wet. The mood had shifted again, not just stunned silence, but something more emotional. More human. The journalist leaned back, visibly moved. Even the camera crew had stopped filming for a moment. They weren't thinking about airtime anymore. They were watching a man unload years of pain in real time. Michael turned back toward Kash and looked him in the eye for the first time since the panel began. "And for you," he said, "it might be numbers. But to me, it's names. It's birthdays. It's people we bury too soon." The moment sat like a thundercloud. Kash didn't respond. He couldn't. Because there was no comeback for what had just happened. Michael hadn't made it about politics. He had made it about people. And Kash had walked right into it. Michael folded the picture again and slipped it back into his coat. "Justice," he said one last time, "starts when we stop pretending these stories don't matter." And with that, he sat down. Slowly. Controlled. The audience didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence said more than applause ever could. In the minutes that followed, the moderator attempted to salvage the event. He threw a few generic questions to Kash, who answered with less fire. His voice was steady, but his energy was gone. The audience was still with Michael. Even those who had come to support Patel were quiet now, their notes untouched, their expressions unreadable. What had started as a policy discussion had turned into a reckoning. And the tension, once sharp and prickly, had melted into something more still and reflective. The weight in the room wouldn't lift easily. As the panel wrapped and the applause finally came, measured, respectful, slow, Michael stepped down first. No entourage. No waves. Just one hand briefly raised in acknowledgement. People parted for him as he moved through the crowd, not out of celebrity, but reverence. He had said something many had felt for years and never dared speak in rooms like this. And while the cameras had captured the words, they hadn't captured the weight. Because the real moment wasn't about headlines. It was about truth. The room had barely recovered when the moderator asked one final question, this time directed at both speakers. If you could leave us with one final thought, just one sentence, what would it be? He said it like a formality, a way to close the event neatly. But everyone in that room knew this was the moment. Michael sat still for a beat. Kash looked down at his notes, ready to go first. He offered a practice line about law and order, about keeping communities safe, something that sounded clean and polished. Something that didn't leave a scratch. Then Michael looked up. His voice was soft but clear. You want to talk about justice, he said, pausing just long enough. Justice is when people like you finally get quiet long enough to hear what silence really sounds like. The words didn't shout. They didn't even sting. They pierced. The room didn't just fall silent, it froze. That sentence wasn't just a clapback. It was a mirror. And in it, everyone saw the difference between performance and truth. Kash blinked. His jaw tensed. For a second, he looked like he might respond, but the words never came. The weight of Michael's sentence didn't leave space for it. It had turned the debate into a confession booth, and everyone knew who had just been found guilty, not by law, but by conscience. The journalist didn't speak either. He just nodded slowly, recognizing something that didn't need a follow-up. One sentence had flipped the room upside down. As the panel wrapped and the guests started to stand, conversations were hushed. People turned to each other, their faces full of the kind of surprise that only comes from seeing something honest in a space built on performance. Michael didn't stick around to mingle. He walked straight toward the exit, pausing only to nod at the volunteers holding the doors. One of them whispered, "Thank you," and Michael gave a small smile. It was the only one all night. The rest of his face stayed still, because the moment wasn't about pride. It was about purpose. Social media lit up before he even reached the car. Clips of the sentence were already circulating with captions like, "Michael B. Jordan shuts it down," and one line changed the whole room. But Michael didn't read any of it. He turned off his phone and stared out the window as the car pulled away from the Civic Center. The city lights blurred as his mind drifted, not to the panel, not even to Kash, but back to Damon. He wondered if his brother had felt even a flicker of justice from what happened. If he would hear about the sentence. If it would matter. In the car's dim cabin light, Michael pulled the folded photo from his pocket again. It was worn now, corners bent from years of being carried close. He looked at it for a long time, then whispered, "You saw that, didn't you?" No one answered, of course. But the silence after that moment wasn't heavy like before. It was peaceful. Not victory, but release. Not closure, but something close enough to let him breathe for the first time in years. Back at the Civic Center, people were still buzzing. Some looked shaken. Others looked changed. And Kash. He had disappeared quietly, ducking out a side door while the crowd was still processing what had just happened. Reporters tried to catch him for a comment, but his team said he had another engagement. What he really had was the realization that sometimes one sentence, spoken at the right moment, carries more truth than 1,000 pages of policy. In that one moment, Michael hadn't just spoken for himself. He had spoken for every name erased, every case forgotten, every cell filled because someone thought power meant never having to listen. And in that moment, Michael reminded the world that sometimes, power is nothing compared to presence. Long after the crowd had left and the lights inside the Civic Center had dimmed, the buzz from the night still echoed through the city like electricity in the air after a storm. The sentence Michael spoke had already made it to every corner of the internet. It was clipped, captioned, analyzed, and shared. Politicians weighed in. Activists called it the moment of the year. Cable news debated its tone, its meaning, and its implications. But none of that mattered to Michael. What mattered was what came after, the silence that followed the noise. The moments no one captured. The hours when he had to sit with the weight of everything he had just put into the world. The morning after the panel, Michael woke up early. The sky outside his window was still pink with the first signs of sunrise. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel dread getting out of bed. He made coffee, fed his dog, and sat by the window, watching the city move before it was fully awake. On the table beside him, his phone buzzed. He reached over and picked it up. Most messages were what he expected: support, praise, interview requests. But one message made him stop. It was from a woman named Kendra Williams. She had worked as a junior clerk in the office that had handled Damon's appeal. In the message, she said she remembered the file, remembered how rushed everything felt, remembered how decisions were pushed through without review. She apologized. Then she attached something. A scanned copy of a suppressed memo. It was a written opinion from a retired judge that had never made it into the final file. In it, the judge had raised concerns about the case, the speed, and the pressure. It had been left out, on purpose. Michael read it 3 times, slowly. Then he sat back in his chair, holding the phone like it weighed 100 pounds. The truth had been buried for years. Now it had surfaced, not because someone wanted justice, but because someone heard something that finally made them listen. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just sat still, the same way he had in that courtroom years ago. But this time, it wasn't helplessness he felt. It was movement. Over the next few days, the story didn't die down, it grew. Not just because of the sentence, but because of what came next. Michael didn't do another interview. He didn't sign on to any shows. Instead, he made one quiet call to Damon's lawyer. Then another to a journalist he trusted. Then another to a senator's aide he'd met at a past fundraiser. The wheels turned slowly at first. But they turned. Because when truth is undeniable, silence starts to crack. Kash Patel never responded publicly to the sentence. He posted a short note about healthy debate and diverse opinions, but he never addressed Michael's words directly. Because deep down, he knew that one sentence had broken through something his whole career had been built on: control. And now, that control was slipping. Weeks passed. Then a month. Then 2. Michael stayed out of the spotlight. He spent more time with his mother. Took long walks. Read books he hadn't touched in years. He didn't stop fighting, but he stopped rushing. He had learned that impact didn't always need to be loud. That sometimes, presence meant more than pressure. And in that quiet, something shifted. One night, just before bed, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. From a blocked number. He answered. A voice on the other end said, "Mr. Jordan, I'm with the Board of Review. We've reopened Damon's case." That was it. No promises. No outcome. Just motion. Just a crack in the wall that had stood for too long. He didn't call anyone. He didn't post. He just stood in the middle of his living room, eyes closed, holding the phone to his chest. The same way he had held that photo. The world outside still moved. But for one moment, everything inside him was still. Because sometimes, justice doesn't shout. It whispers.